Hey crafters and cosplayers, welcome to the craft class. In this episode, I will be demonstrating how I cover EVA foam with Worbla. If you enjoy this video, please feel free to share it, and if you would like to support in any way, there is a link to my Ko-fi account on my Instagram bio. There is also full and mini tutorials on sewing, crafting and more. You can also find me on Facebook and on YouTube. Worbla is a commonly used crafting material amongst costume makers and prop makers. When Worbla is heated, it becomes moldable and you can use it to wrap around existing shapes like EVA foam or balsa wood, for example. I use this material on a lot of my own projects. It's incredibly versatile and it's available in different types. For this demonstration, I'll be covering an EVA blade for 2-cusses spearhead from Dr. Stone, and these principles can be applied to most items that you would need to cover. Before one starts covering the EVA foam with Worbla, you want to make sure that you've got all your details down that would be underneath the Worbla. I always try and get as much detail in as possible on the EVA foam. Unless my details need to be placed on top of the Worbla, I try and keep it all in one. In some cases, you can cover components of a prop separately and then attach them afterwards. So right now, as you can see, I'm just busy cleaning up the edges of the EVA blade. I'm adding in as much detail as possible that I can then accentuate using the Worbla once it's being covered. Worbla usually adds about a 1mm bulk around the object that you'll be covering. Some of your details may disappear a little bit once you cover it with Worbla, but that's okay because you can go in afterwards with some sculpting tools to define it. Now the EVA blade is ready to be covered with Worbla. If your prop is supposed to have a smooth surface, always make sure that it is as smooth as possible during your prep phase, because every little dent and seam will show through the Worbla as it acts like a vacuum form. Now we are ready to cut out our pieces of Worbla that we'll be using to cover the EVA blade. Place your Worbla down on a cutting mat or a table suitable for cutting. We're going to use the same pattern piece that we used for the EVA pieces, but we're going to be adding a seam allowance to the Worbla with a marker and cut on that edge to make sure that there is enough seam allowance to wrap over the EVA foam. Depending on how thick the item is that you'll be covering, especially on a blade, you want to make sure you're adding enough seam allowance for the edges to wrap around and touch each other. For this blade, I joined 3 pieces of 5mm SPX 120 EVA foam to make it a total of 1.5 cm thick. If you are worried that you are adding too much seam allowance, that's alright, because you can always cut away some of the excess. Rather have too much than too little. Next, we'll be cutting out the Worbla pieces. I generally use a sharp craft knife to cut the Worbla, but you can also use a sturdy scissors if you prefer. When working with any type of blade, always be extra careful and take your time with it. Make sure you cut on the lines and watch out for your fingers. One of my favorite things about Worbla is that you can use every little scrap by either heating it and joining it together or using it to cover smaller items. Once all your pieces are cut out, we can use it to cover the EVA foam. This next step may be optional, but I like to apply a little bit of contact adhesive glue onto the widest part of the EVA foam. This helps to create an extra sticky surface for the Worbla to grip onto. Sometimes Worbla can lift off the foam, so you want to make sure that if you're covering something and the back is exposed or the underneath, you want to make sure that the edges are nice and secure, so you can apply a little bit of contact adhesive to the edges that the Worbla would wrap onto so that it doesn't lift over time. Once the contact adhesive has cured a bit, you can apply the Worbla to the EVA foam and use a heat gun to start shrinking the Worbla around the EVA shape. Make sure you apply enough heat on the Worbla so that it's soft and warm enough to start wrapping around your EVA shape. You'll see it start to sink and you'll see the EVA shape popping up from underneath. Be careful when working with hot Worbla. It can burn your fingers, so make sure that it's heated up just enough that you can start pushing through the details. Be very careful working with the heat gun. It gets very hot, so make sure that it's resting somewhere that it can't burn or melt anything. As you work with the Worbla, it'll start cooling down, so you may have to heat and repeat. I usually apply heat to select sections and then I pull down the Worbla to make sure that it's covered properly. On blades, I generally bring the Worbla down till about halfway on the edge to make sure that the other side matches up. When flipped over, you'll notice the Worbla seam allowance. That we'll be trimming away. Using a sharp blade or scissors, carefully trim away the excess Worbla. When you trim away, make sure that it is even all the way around to make sure that your edges line up and it's easier to join. As you can see, when you flip it back, you'll notice that the shape is looking a lot more crisp. Don't forget to keep all your scraps and offcuts. I like to store this in a container so I can use it on the next project. Now I am covering the other side of the blade using the same process as before. For long EVA blades, I would recommend using a dowel rod or a thin metal rod in the inside to reinforce it so it doesn't lose its shape from the heat. This is a short blade, so I can easily bend it back into shape if I need to. Now that we have covered the other side of the blade, I'm going to trim away the excess Worbla. If you are using a scissors, you can heat the Worbla just a little bit to make it softer so it's easier to cut. Make sure you trim away as evenly as possible. This helps when joining the seam together. To close the seam, I use a heat gun and heat up the edge on both sides. Make sure you apply enough heat so that the edges can mold together. I like to use metal sculpting tools when working with Worbla because plastic tools can sometimes stick. Make sure you apply enough pressure so that the two sides bond properly. Sometimes I join the seam completely and then I switch to the details, but in this case I'm adding details as I go along by using my sculpting tools to refine it. If a prop has different components, I like to make sure that I sculpt each component separately. That way, if I need to apply heat to a section, I don't have to worry about the heat affecting any other part of the prop. When your Worbla starts to cool down a bit, you can switch to plastic tools so you can get different types of details and effects. Now I'm just making sure that the edges are joined properly and I'm going over it with a metal tool to smooth it out. I'm going to work all around the blade now and just add in all the other details and make sure the seams are all joined properly. In the next scene you'll see the fully covered blade. Here is the fully covered EVA blade. I used some sculpting tools to join the seams and to add some extra details. If your item needs to have a smooth finish, you can go ahead and sand or prime this so it's ready to be painted. With such a versatile product, the possibilities are truly endless. If you have any questions about Worbla, hit us up in the comment section below. Thank you all for watching, and if you would like to support in any way, there is a link to my Ko-fi account on my Instagram bio. Any support received goes towards a fund for crafting materials and supplies, which help in the creation of these tutorials. Keep on crafting, and we'll see you next time.